good afternoon. I'm Christine Pfister, the owner and director at Pentimenti Gallery. We are delighted to have you with us tonight for our exhibition dialogue. We have a very special program for you today, and but before we begin, we will provide a few simple housekeeping reminders. So this program will be just under 1 hour, and we will have a Q&A where we welcome your questions. You will be mute during the presentations, but please feel free to type your questions in the chat at any time. The Q&A will take place at the end of the dialogue. So I would like to thank our 4 exhibiting artists, Alanna Airitam, Helena Metaferia, Alisa Sikelianos-Carter, and Nastassja E. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you, and we are thrilled to feature your work in our first group exhibition this year. Making marks, figural identity, transfigurations, and receptive tactility. We look to the art to help us make sense of our world and to inspire us. For this show, my curatorial process revolves around the concept that art is also a powerful force with which we promote social change. But I'm going to be brief, and I'm here to present our moderator, Brittany Webb, the Evelyn and William Kaplan Curator of 20th Century Art and the John Robin Collection at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Art. So thank you, Brittany, for your critical work reaching the forward for these exhibitions. Your perspective is deeply valued, and your enthusiasm and your collaboration throughout the process of the exhibition and this event. So I'm gonna just pass on to you, Brittany, to begin the program. And again, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. So Brittany.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. First, I want to say thank you to all of the artists for being in dialogue. I always think it's incredible to get to talk to artists about their process. You all make work that is so thoughtful and so vulnerable. To then extend yourselves into this conversation feels like such an incredible luxury. So I wanted to open with that. For folks on the call, I think a lot of people won't necessarily have gotten to see the exhibition yet, even though it is open in the galleries. So I really wanted to start off in the work, if we could. So I you know, we are here with such incredible artists. I thought maybe we should go straight into slides. If we could get you all to start talking about your work and your process before we get into a larger conversation, I think that'd be great. Is that okay with you?
Sounds good. I'm so sorry. I think there's somebody at my door, so forgive me. Hi, I'm Alanna Airitam, and I am a photographer. My work is showing here at Pentimenti. I'm really, really excited about this show. A few of the pieces that I have in the show are not the whole collection of Crossroads, but I do have 4 pieces from this particular series. And, you know, a large part of my work revolves around reframing the narrative that we so often get around Blackness. And I really want to focus my work on showing the beauty and showing the empowerment and just giving us a whole different reframing of what it is like to be Black, instead of focusing. So often we see this focus of negativity and pain around Blackness, and I really wanted to show something that was sort of the opposite, while also investigating how we can maybe do something different, you know, like extending out into a different narrative, you know, exploring different options for us instead of just assuming and accepting the things that are given to us, which obviously have not been working for us for so long. These particular Crossroads pieces are finished with resin and encased in metal frames to act as the boxes that were so often put in, and the heaviness of and the weightiness of these pieces also sort of speak to the heaviness of a lot of the work that we have to do as Black folks. So yeah, I wanted to carry that through in the work so that they weren't just portraits sitting there, but they were actual physical objects that have meaning in the finishing as well. How to Make a Country and Take a Look Inside are two other pieces that are in this Pentimenti show. And these are speaking to the history of being a Black woman here in this country. Again, these are both finished in resin along with metal frames. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we only have 5 minutes. So that's a little bit about the work that I have up in the show right now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Helina Metaferia. I am an interdisciplinary artist working across mediums, which include collage, assemblage, installation, video, and performance, and also social engagement. I normally live in New York City. I'm here in Los Angeles right now, escaping the winter and working on a project out here. But virtually, I can be anywhere. So I'm in the gallery in Philadelphia with my backdrop. So the work that I have in the exhibition is from my Refiguring the Canon series, which I began in 2018. And that work is collage and video. And that body of work focuses on the undertold and overlooked narratives within Western art history, particularly in the framing of, I don't know if we can go to the next slide. So you can see the work that I'm talking about. Great, thank you. Particularly in the framing of canons of culture. And so I came into doing this work because I was doing some residencies and came across these archives of periodicals from the 1980s, really all decades. And I was focusing a lot on the 1980s because I was born in the 80s, and I wanted to understand who was celebrated in that the legitimizing periodicals of the time, who was celebrated, who was noted for. And of course, and not surprising, there was this undertelling of the Black women artists, the BIPOC artists of color, and also the undertelling of women in general within these canons of art history. But there was a celebration of what's considered the primitive, particularly with MoMA's Modern and the Primitive exhibition in 1984-85. And I was really curious as to what if this primitive, this unknown genderless person could speak, and what if I could perform that on paper? So I used my old performance stills and I collaged with the ephemera of these art periodicals around my form. Sometimes they are adorning my form. Sometimes they are coming from my form in the form of gestures. But they inherently are miniaturized because of the scale of those periodicals. And then my form becomes mostly life-size. And so this was a gesture of resistance. I am an artist who works in many disciplines. So some of those, my primary practice is in painting. So at least for my formative years. And so I was really turned towards performance and towards acts of resistance because they are inherently tied to protest. And a lot of my work is been informed by, like, I would love to just make formal work, but it seems that there's these systems that we work within that are always putting these constraints on us. And so as a maker, I'm deeply invested in bringing some of those barriers down to the best of my ability, using my platforms to do that. So in addition to the collage work, I ended up doing these performances, which are available on video at the gallery, where I am collaging in time and space, essentially using my entire body in the collections of Saul LeWitt or Barton Newman or Mark Rothko within the National Gallery of Art, and also at Massimoca, doing these gestures of intervention for the camera, sometimes for the live audience, into these historic artworks that are celebrated. I wanted to see if I could politicize the works further. And although the artists are trying to work in abstraction, which is considered high thought, and away from identity politics, I'm bringing in that sort of conversation by bringing in my form as a Black woman. To highlight the gender and the race of those makers that are esteemed and collected heavily in institutions. So as I said before, I do work in formalism. I do work in this way that is much more sort of gestural, but I think that I tend to return towards acts of image-based work and collaging as these sort of political practices within the larger scheme of my practice. So that is the work. I think I've timed myself. I am still under 5 minutes, so I think I'm going to go ahead and pass the baton forward.
Hi, thank you. My name is Elisa Sikelianos-Carter, and I am a painter, a mixed media painter. If we could just go ahead and I'll talk about the work as I see it in the slide. But well, anyway, so my work is based around this mythology of Black people and our bodies responding to racism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And the work that's currently at Pentimenti, this piece, and you'll see the others, but they are all within that framework. And so it's figure-based. It's also thinking about our bodies, specifically our hair, responding and augmenting and becoming this sort of biological armor that is fused and a part of us. And I'm thinking about these beings who have sort of mutated into these godlike alien species as a response and protective mechanism. Initially, I was thinking about them as future beings that transform and survive and kind of make it out of this current state that we're in. But then I started to think about what if they kind of went back before this moment and as like an intervention within time. So if the previous slide, the blue one, that is like a moment where, during the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans sort of jumping to escape enslavement ultimately. And that's a moment where they, instead of going on, they were able to transform and become these mer people who survive and live underwater. So that's like a kind of moment in history that these future ancestors, these beings come into play. And then this idea that they also are existing in the future and leaving this world and sort of creating their own world where there's this like abundance and everything that they need is within them and in this world. So they're not in need of anything. They have everything. And so like the materials that I'm using, I'm thinking about that. I'm really drawn to like opulent, rich materials that to me represent like magic, but also wealth. And I'm utilizing images of hair to describe these beings and sort of like what that would look like. So I use collage, hand cut collage and prints. I'm using like, painting on paper and panel. And this is an example of a future ancestor. So these beings that their heads have, grown into these crowns is what I call them. And they're a part of the being. They're not, I don't see them as like a mask. They're very much grown out of our bodies, but they sort of do the same thing that they protect us. They keep us from, harm. They protect us from harm. So yeah, these are just examples of those different images. The previous images, I'm also working like abstractly and thinking about hair and sort of spell work and like what these beings might be, how they might speak or like cast this magic. So it's like both figure and abstraction. And yeah, I don't know, I didn't time myself, so I think that I'll say we're good. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Nastassja Swift. I consider myself to be a sculptural fiber artist. I am currently in Virginia. I'm doing a residency at the Contemporary Arts Network in Newport News. Much of my work, I primarily work in wool, and much of my work exists in installation, often performance, and then this form of kind of sculptural portraiture. As I define it, the face is a really important and a really special visual or object for me to work with. So that is kind of the repeating image or motif in my work. But I'm interested in the ways in which uh, space and history and the histories tied into spaces and language and how those things, how we kind of organically use them to define ourselves and the way we exist in space, but also the way in which those things define our identity and our bodies, but also how they can often disrupt that identity or that definition that we put on ourselves or each other. With this piece specifically, I was interested in reinterpreting spiritual practices and referencing older West African mask and sculpture and thinking about replacing the faces of people that I know with those masks and kind of challenging the idea of worship and how we associate certain people or certain things to a higher standard or kind of just this immense amount of power we give to these other beings and what that means to give that power or that spiritual presence or energy to someone that we know. And in thinking about much of my work, I'm kind of like making the visual of a piece of a story, but I'm thinking about the story in its entirety. So with that pink piece, not just making this sculpture that speaks to a rites of passage around hair, but like thinking about the women and the girls that are present for that rites of passage in that ceremony and thinking about what's taking place, how what the energy in that space at that time. So I often think of myself as like narrating this larger story that often I only know the whole story and I'm just giving a piece of it through these wool sculptures. And with the next piece that's in the show, it's part of a series where I'm again thinking about language and how it can negatively define Blackness and Black bodies, and exploring the idea of euphemisms and the way language and pop culture or media culture can purposefully but appears to be subtle, appears to be done in a subtle way, kind of define our spaces and our communities and our bodies. And then with the performance mask, it was used for performance a few years ago. So I've been interested. I think that when I work in phases, those phases often overlap. So although I haven't done a performance for some time, I still am very much interested in the way these faces become activated on human bodies, specifically Black female bodies. Um, and thinking about mask making and mask wearing and how they're used and why they're used, and the stories that kind of become unleashed when they're worn through performance. Thinking about who's being, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Brain fart. Thinking about who's being emphasized, or I guess immortalized in a way, but not necessarily taking anything away from the wearer. I'm very interested in how there's kind of an interdependent relationship between the mask and this space of this person or this being that I'm tapping into, but also how that relates to the person that's wearing it. And how I can tap into stories related to both figures, and most of the time in relationship to space and the history of space.
Yeah. So first off, thank you for that. I mean, I feel like you guys were really incredibly judicious with your time. We flew through so much work. I'll be happy to get to return to it in a bit during the conversation. Um, but one of the things that I found really striking about the body of work in the show and the expansive ways that you all work across media was just the breadth of different uh, influences and materials in your practices. I mean, the work in this exhibition, you know, we're talking about photography, collage, performance. Um, you know, Alanna, there's a way that you turn these images, these photos into almost sculptures by encasing them in this resin and making them heavy and made of metal. And Nastassja, your sculptures are not heavy at all. They're light. They literally float in air because you're working with such soft materials. Um, Elisa, I think there's really something to the surfaces that we get in your work. It's really fascinating to think about how you get that ethereal quality. Sometimes we're sort of taken out of space. There are pieces that feel like we're underwater. There are other works that feel like we're in outer space. And there's a really incredible use of glitter, which is a tough material to work with. And it comes off as so skilled and so sophisticated that if you haven't been in the galleries, I hope you'll pay attention to all of the incredible things that are happening with material across this work. And Helena, your collages are really expansive, I think. There's something really fascinating about the approach to the canon as being a kind of, you know, taking to task the material artifacts of a recent art history, the history of modernism, through these periodicals, right? The materials of the magazines to make your figure or to make a figure larger than life by taking these miniature pieces and making sure that instead of actually being an element that overshadows your practice, it kind of shrinks down. You become the larger figure. You become the remixer of the canon as a way not just to theoretically work against the canon, but to try to make that material, to make it so that as viewers, when we interact with your work, we're watching a hand remix time or remix a canon so that we reconfigure all this work. I mean, there's something really incredible about that. And that ended up being why time felt like a through line that was really important to talk about, to just try to get a handle around what felt to me like such disparate works, because your work is so different. So I wanted to ask you all if you felt like, you know, if you had that same sense of yourselves together, having your work in this show. I think we all talked ahead of time about we didn't all know each other. And so when you came to this show, when you saw your work together, when you saw the connections and the overlap and places where there were really productive sort of tensions or departures, did you have that sense of the work?
Yes. Um, I think for me, I mean, just like hearing everyone speak about the work was really helpful because we haven't actually done that, and so that was really it. Like, I mean, obviously seeing the images, but then hearing you all talk about it, just the through lines and connections. It was like really exciting to sort of know how, even though it's so different, how much we relate. And I think you already called this, Brittany, but like with hair and also with the figure and with time, I did not recognize that, I think, initially, but I think over time and seeing the images and then hearing everyone speak about it, it was really it's very clear, like the way that it's all interwoven.
I think the first thing that I noticed, well, one of the first things that I noticed, once looking at the work of each artist and searching each other, I was interested in the way that we're approaching the body and the figure and like the presence of Blackness. Because like you said, Brittany, we're doing it in a very different way, but I also think that we're doing it in a different way from each other, but I also think that we're doing it differently. Even with Alanna's work representing the body and the full figure, it's because of what she's doing materially and turning these photos into objects. I think that it's still in line with how we're choosing to kind of distort the idea of portraiture and figurative work. And I think, and maybe I don't know if I want to use the word distort, but I also cannot think of a word that I want to use in place. So we're just going to use that there as a placeholder. But, and maybe I mean fragmented, but just we're approaching figurative work in a very different way. So I think that was something that was one of the things that stood out to me when thinking of like my work in the puzzle of these other three pieces, and then thinking about the work in the show as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious is that, we're 4 Black women. And there's that, like, okay, there's 4 Black women, 4 different perspectives of what it means to come to the world with that view. But I think there is a lot of nuances that were really exciting to see. So I don't want to overlook the obvious, but I do want to sort of address that we're not a monolithic group, like there's so many different experiences that we carry. We have different backgrounds and, geographic locations and interests and materiality, and we're all makers, and that's really the commonality. So I think what attracted me to sort of participate when I saw the group was these sort of more subtle conversations, because when I saw Nastassja's work and I was thinking about her use of performance and the theatrics of that, and then my own reference to performance work or image and how reclaiming images in Alanna's work, or Alisa's also hybridity of like this interdisciplinary sort of mixed media practice. And so those things were more interesting to me than the obvious, which is that, we are by birth born into these bodies that are marked in a certain type of way. So I think that those are the kind of the subtleties. And it's my hope that when people see a show like this, that they are also addressing and thinking about the subtleties of what it means to be a maker, and how those how different views can come together in that way.
I think that was the most exciting part for me, was looking at the different materials that we all choose to work with, and how we tell those stories through those materials. And I just found it really fascinating to see such depth of conversation happen within each person's individual works using their different materials. I think that it's easy to focus on the, like Helena was saying, the obvious, the fact that we're all Black women, but that's like, to me, was not the most exciting part of this, us coming together. It was how our materials work in unison together, how they, you know, would appear opposite to each other, and just the conversations that they all have, the heaviness versus the lightness, or the, you know, the smaller pieces versus the bigger pieces. And I just find that to be really exciting. I would love to be able to see the whole thing in person, because I bet that that's really exciting to see all of that in one space.
Yeah, and given that, I wanted to ask, you know, as artists, do you think that there are limits to being read by viewers, by audiences, by students, by collectors, by curators as Black women makers?
Yes. I do find that there are limitations to that. I find that just in the labeling of being a Black female artist is limiting in itself, because it feels like a subset of the overarching, like, I'm an artist or I'm a photographer. So now all of a sudden you've contracted it into this small little box, this label that you're kind of stuck within. And even if you want to make work outside of that context, like you don't want to talk about race, you don't want to talk about what it's like to be a woman, you're still sort of pigeonholed within that structure, within that conversation, because that's what everyone else is going to read into it, right? So to try to not be political is still being political, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that was the whole work that I had in the show was from the Refiguring the Canon series, because it's very much about the lens in which history is archived, and it really turning history into mythology, because the way that we look at collected documentation, the way that we look at what is archived within museum collections, you know, there's obviously there is bias, there's hierarchy, there's narrow and short-sighted view that are all informed by systemic racism and oppression. And it's really hard to make art work in an industry. I mean, you go through the education systems, this is how you're trained, and then there's a negation of history. Being Ethiopian American, I'm very aware with my own independent research on Ethiopian art history, and really the long painting traditions, like the long traditions of ritualistic art, for example. And it's not something that is considered on the same playing field as Western canon. So, I mean, that's kind of like, I've had to address these things head on in my work, because it was so hard to just be a painter. Like I couldn't just be a painter focusing on form. There were so many things that I felt were unjust, or there was a double consciousness, to adapt a Du Bois word, that I had to kind of head on in sort of these systems. And I teach at Brown University, and I'm very active of like trying to shift that within academia, and within institutional spaces, but it's very difficult. So instead of being able to do that kind of work, I've had to sort of take on this more protest position as a maker, which I'm happy to do. It's exhausting and tiring, but it's the only way that I feel like I can sort of make sense and justify my placement in these sort of white cubes, you know, literally white cubes. And then I know that once I feel like, all right, I'm done with that work, like I'm ready to move on, I'll go back to my formalist making, and then the next generation will continue and pick it up. So that's how I look at it. I feel like you can't get away from the Black woman label, and so might as well just like deal with it head on. And then eventually, in a time when we're all a little bit more ready for, which I hope is right now, then that won't be necessary.
I think for me, it's challenging because because I'm working with the figure. I think a lot of people assume that make a lot of assumptions about the gender of the figures, and because they read me as a woman, and so they're thinking that like this is something like it's like a representation of like the feminine or like the divine feminine, which I don't subscribe to. So I think like that it is the representation of the divine, but I'm not gendering that in any way. And so I think it's like a lot of people will look at the work and think, you know, like the marks themselves are like very like female or womanly or something. I mean, even like in the back, like because of like this sort of movement or something, and that's like not at all how I'm. I mean, people have made those comments, but that's not how I'm approaching the work. So I think that like that, the way that people read me and then they sort of subscribe these ideas or attach these ideas of like what or actions or emotions to the figures in my work, when I'm really thinking of this more as like sort of genderless and like it's not this world. So like whatever your idea of gender in this world is, it's like that's not the world I'm creating. It's like a way more expansive. So I feel like, I mean, everything that everyone else said, and like that specifically to like the direct images in my work.
Yeah, I'll make sure I'm unmuted. I think when I think about that question, or just the limitations of being labeled a Black artist or a Black woman artist, I think about the limitations of the boxes that that we're then placed in, and then how often we're pulled from that box to be used for one reason or another. So and especially in terms of like how Black creativity or Black bodies or anything within the subject can become trendy, and we've seen that last year through all that took place, and then feeling like now it's time to go pick into the Black artists box. I think that's something that's like a bit nerve-wracking, but also like frustrating, because it's like, well, I want to be considered as just an artist. So when you put together whatever you're putting together, don't just come and think of me when it's time to pull from the Black box. So I think that's where my mind goes when I think about the limitations of that label, and how necessary I think it is for us as artists to kind of be not necessarily, I think it's, I was going to say being considered among all contemporaries, but I think that there's this implied disvalue that's placed on our work when we're only pulled for a specific reason at a specific time, and not just in general. So, not needing to be a part of the Black Fiber show, but just the contemporary fiber show, because my work can be in conversation with a larger group of fiber artists just as much as it's always going to be in conversation with Black female fiber artists.
And you're all doing that, sort of pushing against labels and boxes in so much of your work, right? One of the things that I thought was really fascinating and striking was, how in preparing to write for this show, how often you would talk about yourselves as artists. I think Nastassja, I think you and Helena both said that you were painters, and you are not showing paintings. And so there's a way that you're being so expansive about, I'm a painter, I'm a sculptor, I'm a, not sort of, or allowing that as to function as a kind of foil, right? You say I'm a painter, and I'm asking to talk to you about work that isn't painting. And so there's something about that feels intentionally like an intentional trickster move. And so I wondered if you would all sort of reflect on that, as being another way that you push against labels and that you work outside the box in your practice. Could you talk a bit about materials and training? Because there is a way that you all are confounding your training or confounding your paths into the field by saying, okay, so this is my point of entry. And then I pivoted into another direction. And that's why I can describe myself in one way, knowing that you're looking at work that doesn't reflect that description at all.
Yeah. Or Helena, were you gonna go?
I go right ahead.
That I think it's funny that you remembered that, Brittany, for one. And currently, with something that I'm working on, I'm often referencing or using the word painting. And I think that's because that was the language that I was first introduced to with making. And it was a way of making that I was first excited about. I began figurative painting in high school and did it all through undergrad. So using color in that way and using, I mean, even when I was painting, paint felt like a material that wasn't just supposed to go on something, but it was something. And I think that that lends itself into why I'm excited about sculpture and working with this tactile material like wool. But I also think that the way I choose to work with color, or sometimes not with color, um, my my interest in figurative work, I think it's all um, influenced and kind of grounded in the work that I was doing as a painter. So I don't think that, like, I can't get rid of that part of my brain or that part of my hand. Like, I feel like it's just organically there because it was a way that I was working before. And I think that even when I'm not, I don't often while I'm working think of myself as a painter, but I think that there's a part of me that's present while I'm working. Um, and the way I choose to work with wool, um, especially now that I've started dyeing the wool after it's a shape and being interested in the kind of imperfections of color application that happens when you're dyeing something that's been felted as opposed to dyeing the raw wool, and thinking about how that makes me feel like I'm applying color in the way that I want to, as opposed to just using color from a paint tube. So there are like these small actions that happen in the studio that I think speak to why I consider, for example, Inner City to be a fiber wall piece. I consider it to be a painting, and I consider it to be a sculpture.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think interdisciplinary is really big right now. I think a lot of people, a lot of programs are kind of pushing for that. For me, I was trained, just like Nastassja said, as a painter first. I did that in undergrad, figure painting. And I did that throughout my 20s. And when I got to graduate school, when I entered the department, I wanted to paint, which is what I thought I was going to continue to do. And then I realized, because of how racist and how limited the faculty and the kind of the situation was at the time, everything that I did was a problem. When I tried to paint the Black body, it was a problem. Like, it was a problem to do this. Oh, but why the body? Oh, why this? Oh, and then Black body politics just got to be to the point where I felt the only way to address that head on was through performance. First of all, it allowed you to not deny my body. Like, I am a Black person. And so here are the Black figures in action. Here is my community through social practice in action. Second, it was a language of protest. And so to me, that spectacle was necessary. Third, there's something about the way that white folks love seeing Black people move. And I wanted to pivot that. Like, I wanted to play with that history of like minstrel and the history of like being a spectator. And I wanted to use that in a way that could sort of get them to think about how they use their gaze on the Black body and how to shift that gaze. So it became part of the concept. I still paint. I'm actually now focusing a lot more on Ethiopian painting history and integrating those motifs and aesthetics into my practice, just because in my Refiguring the Canon series and all those other things, I just really wanted to refute that canon of history that I was sort of told was overriding, very literally told to override my own sort of understanding of the histories that I had grown up with. But I think I'm in a position in my career and my life, and I'm like a grown-ass woman, and I feel like I could just do what I want. And so like that, as you get older, as you know, just feel like it's more FUs and like just do what you want. And so painting is coming back, and it's full effect into my studio. It's just that I had to get out, very similar to Howardina Pindell, who I love. I mean, she is queen mother goddess of abstract painting, formal work, and had to go make Free White and 21 video performance art because of the situation that she was facing at MoMA as a curator and all the racism she was experiencing. So I felt like that through institutional racism, I had to pivot. And now I think I can come full circle into a practice that has so many different forms, because I feel like the mastery really is in being able to articulate yourself with your voice with clarity and assertiveness, and choosing art mediums that reflect that.
I'm pretty much self-taught in my photography practice, and I grew up in a household where my father did a lot of painting, and so I kind of, I watched that a lot, and I think that there was a part of me that really wanted to be a painter, but I didn't feel like that was necessarily my direction. And I spent a lot of time as a kid growing up and sitting in museums, and I'd go into these rooms where they have these beautiful Dutch Renaissance, still life tables and portraits, and just like the lighting and the detail to me was just so striking. And I wanted to, but I always felt like we were missing from that context. And so as I started to really dive deeper into my practice of being a photographer, I wanted to somehow bring that in and capture it and use that to sort of like put back out a different story, a different narrative, because I felt like somehow we were being denied that beauty and that light, right? So I wanted to like capture it and use it for us. And often I do kind of flip back and forth between calling myself a photographer and calling myself an artist. Like I kind of feel like calling myself a photographer can be very limiting when I have all these ideas, and I don't want to feel like I can't expand beyond that and use different materials to produce the stories that I want to share. Not everything fits in a photographic context. So I do kind of flip back and forth on that, and I've got a little pushback on that before. The photo community is very, very tight, very proud, so but it just feels like I don't like I already feel like we're so limited in the labels that we have to hold anyway. Like, why continue to just add more labels onto myself? So I want to just leave that open so that I can go and explore how to use, maybe even just how to use photography in different ways, like incorporating the resin into it and incorporating metal and making them into objects and taking them outside of just a print. That to me was really important in my work, is the finishing of it, and like, how does this what is this portrait saying? Like, what is this piece saying? And the finishing of it for me goes beyond just sticking it in a frame. Like, it has to say what it's going to say all the way through to the end. So exploring different materials in that way is important. And when you start getting outside of just standard photographic prints, then what do you call yourself, right? So yeah. I don't know where I was going with that, but that's what I have to say.
I think for me, I mean, I was trained in school, like I did an MA, but my sort of like traditional training was like really condensed and happened later in life. And so like I obviously am utilizing it in my work, but it's not, I sometimes don't, I mean, I sometimes think I'm self-trained. It's not true, but that's how I feel because of like the way that my life sort of worked out. And I think when I'm making, I'm always just trying to get back to like what it felt like to make art like in my youth or like in my early 20s, because I was like very much into printmaking and collage. And in high school, like sort of like painting and collage and mixing. So it's like all the, like I'm doing the same things I've always been doing. And so like the training was sort of just like boosting that. And I think that materially, I feel like you had asked this question a while ago, Brittany, but like, I think about like what people don't usually ask me, but I think like I'm sort of more, I'm like a material worshiper. Like that's what really drives me. Like the story is, and the mythology is a part of it, but like when I'm making, I'm really interested in like layering and sort of building up the surface, as you said, and that's sort of the goal. And then like it supports the narrative. And so I feel like that's like it's like equally important. It's like almost sometimes more important is like, what am I using and how can I like just amplify this world and sort of just like keep yeah, like driving up the magic of it. I'm keep looking at the work in my room, but yeah. And so I think, I mean, my training is totally important, and I wouldn't be where I am without sort of like having had that time to like experiment with collage and sort of come to, that's like where I came to the crowns and thinking about how to like, you know, find images on the internet. And then I like learned like all this digital stuff. They were like really bananas looking initially, and then I like got better at them. But I feel like, yeah, that's essentially it. Just, yeah.
Well, what's really great about that is, you know, I thought what was really sort of incredible and confounding was the ways that in all of these separate conversations, each of you said, you know, I come to you as ABC, and yet the work is XYZ. And I thought, like, oh, it's so interesting to sort of like watch this gap between the sort of like the label, the self-identification, like, hi, I'm a blank. And none of our conversation is going to be about that. It's actually going to be about, you know, the work. And so I think, you know, part of what is incredible about makers is that kind of trickery, that kind of intentional flummoxing, and material is what takes us there. And I think that this is a show that is so materially abundant. You know, Alanna, you have these photos that are heavy like sculptures, and Nastassja, your sculptures are soft and ethereal, and also, you know, the wall pieces that are paintings. And then, you know, your approaches to collage, Helena and Elisa, are so vastly different, and there's so many lush surfaces. I thought I would love to hear you all talk about how the body is functioning and how the figure is functioning across these different materials, because some of you are pushing against theoretical canons, some of you are doing that sort of physically. I'm fascinated by the use of hair in so many of your works. I'm also fascinated by these portraitures where you have sitters or figures intentionally turning away from the viewer. There's something really lovely about that in the gallery. And then all of the kind of bodily fragmenting where sometimes we're only looking at a face, or we only have a head or a mask, Nastassja, or Elisa, what you do with just the hair, just the crown, just the sort of top of the head, that is not even just a body. It's just the kind of scalp and the hair floating in space. I wonder if you could just talk about your processes and the surfaces that you're making, and all of these very different approaches to the bodies that you're taking.
I think for me, like, obviously hair is a huge part of my work. It's like the center of it next to material, as I said. I see the hair as, I mean, it's like, it's a power symbol within Black culture. And so it was like sort of the perfect vehicle to imagine this new world, like this response. And I love the idea of like hair being this sentient being that was like activated by the like racism and sort of all the commentary. Like it has its own sort of desire to be something. I mean, it's already great, we know, look at us, but like to be even greater, you know. And like and so it, I mean, the figure is super important to me, but I also, my figures are often silhouettes. They're not, you know, like there's not a lot of detail, which I think I like that, because it's, again, it's, you're not, it's not, I want them to be seen as like non-binary or just sort of genderless or both, or I don't want that to be what's like kind of at the forefront of the viewer's mind. I'm more interested in like them being these vessels, the figures, the bodies, as of magic and power. And so like, what can, if you're not thinking about sort of the gender or the different aspects of the body, like what can these bodies do, and like and what do they hold, what is the energy that they hold. And so I really, I mean, I obviously, there's images where I don't use the figure, but it's, to me, it's still referencing like the Black on Black paintings, Look at Me series, like that. It's still, it's thinking about the hair, you know, like the movement of the hair, and so it's still like connected, but I think I am always just sort of thinking about the way, like movement and energy. And I use the word, I overuse the word magic, but I think the manipulation of energy and like how we can as beings like sort of control that and like activate our surroundings. And so that's why I'm like that's what the body is like representing for me. Yeah, I think there'll probably be more, but yeah.
I don't think I focus so much on hair. I think of crowns and adoration, like moments of adorning oneself as a way to take information that's maybe whether it's positive or negative, and to make them affirmations. So I've used a lot of like kind of like recurring motif of crowning or adorning the hair. And in the case of the Refiguring the Canon series, that's been with these miniaturized reproductions of like Van Gogh flowers, for example. And so what does that mean? Like I think one thing is like, although there is this sort of like fascination and desire to suppress Black women's hair, there is sort of this like awe of like, how do you do what you do? Can I touch? And I feel like that's such a like cliche within Black community. It's such a cliche subject that I don't really want to think about. I don't actually ever think about that when I make these collages, but I do know that we do take care of ourselves really well, and that we know how to style and groom. Just historically, there's just so much pride, like being an Ethiopian woman, like, you know, thinking even about the traditions in the South, and like just all these different ways in which Black women have taken care of our hair and adorned ourselves in that way. And so I think that there is something about, whether I use my own body or bodies from people in my community, there's something about performing our elegance and our strength, and that being the mode in which the message is carried.
Yeah, I like that, Helena, that what you just said, the mode in which the message is carried, because I think about hair when I use it as kind of like this coded language that not everyone can speak, and encoded language through experience, the memories that are kind of tacked on to that. I think that when I'm working with braids or Bantu knots, I almost like reimagine the conversation and the space that I'm having the conversation with another Black person or person of color as like this secret society of a language and an experience. And it's like, oh yeah, I remember when, you know, I was at the salon, or when I used to sit on the floor, my mom was doing my hair and we watched whatever. It's like this experience that's extremely intimate, and I feel like it's special because it's not a broad experience, and I like the way that hair can kind of articulate those memories and those moments in that experience without actually having to say it. It's just the fact that it's there. These braids on the floor, the way they become a crown in Helena's work, it that language is present, and it's loud, but it's not. It's loud in that language, if that makes sense. Like, to us, we can read it, and others can recognize it, but they may not understand it. And I think that's a really beautiful moment. Um, and I think for me, the figure, I mean, again, the figure was something that I learned how to draw a face through drawing my mother's face while she was cooking. So there's like this very intimate experience with making the face that I think I hold on to. And I'm even if I happen to make non-figurative work at some point, I feel like the lips will be present, if anything, or the nose. Like, there are parts of the face that are the face itself is special, and the features of the face are important. And now I feel like, especially with Passage, and Inner City, I'm interested in pushing the face um past just like the visual object of this story, but like a physical object that's making larger images. So the coils around her neck being faces, and that's how we're familiar with that shape, but also thinking of it as a shape, and thinking of it as a medium, thus being able to create whatever I want it to create, because it's more than just the face. So I think those are the ways that hair and the figure is functioning for me in my work.
I have to say, Nastassja, your work for me, like when I see the braids on your figures, it just reminds me so much of being a little girl myself. There's just like this, I just want to hug all of your pieces and just tell them I love them. They're really sweet. Figure for me obviously plays a huge role being a portrait photographer. And I think what I'm trying to do is have conversations through those faces, or not faces, like in the Crossroads series that are there. Just the fact that you can't see their faces is saying something. And I wanted to empower people to protect the gaze, to be able to reclaim that space and say, like, you don't get access to me now. You get access to me when I choose to give you access. In some of my other portraits where they are face forward, especially some of the male portraits that I do, like, it's really important for me that there's like extreme eye contact, because I feel so often that Black men don't get the respect of being looked at in the eyes, so if I have this opportunity to have a conversation, I want to force that to happen. It's why I ask sometimes for the work to be placed at more of like an eye level, where you have to make eye contact with them, you have to form a relationship with them. It's a way for me to create that environment, or that respect that we so often don't get. So yeah, figure for me is huge. And in the Crossroads work, for them to be facing away from the camera obviously is denying for the gaze, and it's also a way for them to look towards something else, look towards something new. In this work, it's largely about, I'm trying to have a dialogue or ask a question around, what do we do when we're continuing to get the crumbs of culture, the crumbs of society, these things that do not work for us, and we keep having to live within this system that does not work for us. At what point do we turn away from that and look towards something new and look for solutions elsewhere? So, I'm trying to find new ways to use the body to have deeper conversations. And it gets to be really challenging, because when you just have a body to work with and you want to say a bunch of different things, like how do you construct that, right? Like, it's through the sitting, it's through the gaze, it's through the turning away, it's through the costuming, it's through the lighting, so but the center of that is always going to be the figure for me.
That's really lovely. I see that we're coming to the end of time, but we have a great question in the chat that I wanted to ask. Alanna, you mentioned that labeling what you do becomes hard as you enter the work as object over print. Do you see further evolution in that direction? Or does considering that take away from the work needed for the images, which are already thoughtful on their own? And I think this speaks to how you were just thinking about new directions for the figure in your work.
Yeah. I can see an evolution. I'm always, I try to be a little limitless in my process and not, restrict myself to materials or restrict myself to certain processes. I really want the things that I'm trying to say to be held up by the materials that I use, and not the other way around. So I can see where that process will continue to evolve, and I might incorporate different materials into the photographic work. I might not do photography and do something else for a little while, I don't know, but I I love the idea of thinking that whatever it is that I'm trying to say can be supported by the materials that I use, you know?
Well, let's see, we have Christine with us, so I want to thank you all for your time and your words and your work. And I will kick it back to Christine to close us out.
Yes, thank you, Brittany. So, yeah, first, thank you all for tuning in tonight and for your amazing remark. We were expecting less than an hour, and now we're above. So I'm delighted that we had this great time to share.